On June 4th, 1975, Muhammad Ali delivered the commencement speech to the Harvard graduating class. And he began with, "I'm told it's a pretty big honor to come to a place like this, and I figured I had better come up with something to talk to these people that's got to be pretty heavy." And on that level, I understand what he's talking about. But he came with nothing prepared. He had no notes to work from. On that level, I'm pretty impressed, because I don't know how he did it. Because then he went on to talk for about 30 minutes, right from the heart, floating between admonitions to understand the power that these new Harvard graduates held, to the need of self-determination for black people, to the flash and the dazzle of the Ali shuffle that made him not only the greatest boxer, but also possibly the greatest entertainer of his generation. He flowed from the gravely serious to outrageously funny with ease, but always illustrating how important it was to understand yourself and your role in making this world better. Now, I knew of this commencement speech because some years ago, someone, I don't know, I can't remember who, but someone told me about the story of how he closed. A person in the audience shouted, "Give us a poem." And the room that had been filled with cheers and hollering and laughter fell silent. And the champ responded, "Me, we." A two-word rhyme, now often credited as the shortest poem in the English language, but one that seemed to sum up not only the liberating journey from selfish to visionary, but also offering up a solution for the angst of the era. Me, we. It was an interrogation of what it means to be a person in this age of rampant individualism, in the age of me, or sometimes even it feels like the age of me, 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 me. But the question, who am I, is then set against the word we as an invitation to explore our personal values and beliefs, but then calling us deeper into communion. Who is this we? Which is perhaps the deeper question. Muhammad Ali, a proud member of the Nation of Islam, a man who was raised in the racist environment of Louisville, Kentucky, even today, really. A man rejected for seeking self-determination for black people, who was convicted for refusing to fight in Vietnam, believing that America was engaging in racist endeavor of overseas colonialism, who was banned from boxing from the age of 25 to 29, some might argue his best years, who had seen himself transition in the eyes of white Americans from beloved to one of the most hated people in the nation, a man who never wavered from his convictions because he knew he was on the side of righteousness, which ultimately allowed him to weather the storm and return as a hero to so many. Here he was, now standing before a largely white audience at Harvard, a white audience with tremendous amount of potential and power, saying, me, we. Who am I? Who are we? How do we move from selfishness to altruism, from isolation to individualism, from isolation of individualism to the life-giving warmth of mutuality? How do we move from this racist nation of dogs and fire hoses to a movement for liberation? How do we move from the age of me to the age of we? Now we're going to explore this in 3 stages today. And it's an interactive service. So does everybody have 4 pipe cleaners? Is anyone missing 4 pipe cleaners? Okay, Randy, can some great person. help. If anybody else is missing, there you go. Hold your hands up. Now, I want you to have 4, and I want you to create a story with these 4. Assign a value or a belief to each one of these pipe cleaners. It could be a moment of transition. It could be something that you really believe that answers the question, who am I? And then tie them together to create a visual representation of how these values and beliefs are guiding you as we move from the age of me to the age of we. And I'm only going to give you a short time to do this, because once you've done that, once you have assigned value and you said, oh, this is, I'm a great singer and I'm liberating people through my, whatever it is, right? You're going to create this thing, and then you are going to turn to your neighbor. If it's convenient that there's 3 of you, turn to a group of 3. And then you are going to shortly tell your neighbor about these values, what it is that is helping you move from an age of me to an age of we. Now, I want you to remember what these values are for each one. So if you need to write them down, because we're going to go into a little sermon back and forth, back and forth. So why don't I give you 1 minute to think about. I will give you 2 minutes. I will give you 2 minutes to think about, what are some 4 core values, beliefs, moments of transition that you think really talk about who you are as we move from the age of me to the age of we. Tie them together. When you do that, after 2 minutes, we will shift to you get to tell your story to your neighbor. All right. Rhea, could you play us a little bit of something jazzy, just to inspire these folks? All right, I'll ring the bell when it's time to start sharing. All right, I'm going to let Rhea keep playing. Oh, you can keep playing. You can keep playing. We're going to wear out her fingers today. We'll see if she's good at, this is her practice time. Now, why don't you turn to your neighbor and tell them what this means, what these values are as we move from the age of me to the age of we. Be economical, because we're going to keep on moving. So, as I mentioned, I knew about this speech, or more importantly, I knew about this poem, Me, We, this powerful 2-word poem that seemed to speak to so much more, that seemed to capture the hope of a generation, because someone had told me about it. And they told me about it just as I told you. And I can't remember who this person was, but I've nurtured that story over the years. I love this poem. So I was a bit surprised to learn, when it came time to do the background research for the sermon, that there is another possible interpretation of what the champ actually said. I had already submitted the title and the sermon blurb to our great spreadsheet in the sky, which, creates the orders of service, which is why it is printed the way it is on the paper that you have in your hands. I was working off what had been given to me through the oral tradition. But I was now faced with the possibility that Ali didn't say me, we, but rather me, we. Right? Whee! The sound of unbridled joy and delight, of pure wonder, which wasn't consistent with the message that I wanted the poem to have. And in fact, it seemed almost contrary to the message I wanted it to have, the celebration of the me. Whee! It seemed kind of inconsistent with this deep interrogation into the self and our purpose to build a better world. And the blogs and the articles seem to agree. The vast majority of the people who have written about this poem, including some poetry analysis sites, interpret Ali as saying me, we, W-E. And the few that acknowledge the possibility of him saying we most include this at the end, and often in a somewhat disparaging way. One commentator summed up this collective irritation of this interpretation by saying, "Me, we," expresses this sense of community and appreciation of togetherness, while "me, we" expresses a freewheeling sense of ego. And so I was confused, so I decided to go to the source of all truth, YouTube, right? And see if I could watch the sermon for myself. And I wasn't able to find an unedited version, but I did find one that had extensive clips, including the poem. And it was beyond clear that the champ said, "Me, whee." So why had this other story appeared? Why had it been handed down to me the way that it had? Why were there so many blogs sharing this story, either consciously choosing to interpret the poem differently than it had been intended, or not doing the research and just passing along the story because it felt better, just kind of like I did? Given the number of voices promoting the WE interpretation over the WHEE interpretation, almost felt desperate. Why were so many people invested in interpreting the poem incorrectly? And I think, like so many things, I think it comes down to race. And I can't say for sure what the race is of all of the writers and bloggers commenting on the poem using the WE interpretation, but the ones I could were white, and I suspect the others were also. Most cited a short clip of George Plimpton from the movie When We Were Kings, which is relevant because George Plimpton was the person who introduced the champ in 1975 at the commencement address. And when you listen to him tell the story, Plimpton does pronounce the poem with an H, whee. But he tells it in such a way that the poem seemed to appear spontaneously as a response to the shout from the crowd for a poem, which is not what happened. Ali set up the poem, saying, "This poem explains how it feels to be as great as me." Me, whee! And if we take the poem out of context of the speech, it might still be interpreted as a sense of braggadocio or bombast. But the champ had just spent 30 minutes talking about being, in part, being able to represent oppressed people and the joy that it brought him. Here was a man who had been vilified for spending more than a decade speaking truth to power, to having people attempt to destroy his career and his good name, to living with constant death threats, to speaking up for his love of black people unabashedly, of being a living embodiment of black history in a nation that was actively denying the teaching of black history. And now, he was being lauded and applauded in the halls of one of the legacy institutions of white power by a generation of up-and-coming leaders who were so excited to hear him speak. How does it feel to dance like a butterfly not only in the boxing ring, but in the ring of popular opinion and do a rope-a-dope on white supremacy? How does it feel to be a global symbol of humanitarianism and liberation? How does it feel to be him? Whee! After watching the video, this seems like one of the most obvious interpretations of the poem. So why were there so many voices invested in interpreting it incorrectly? And again, I think it has to do with race. The me in those articles and blogs was always interpreted as isolated and disconnected, which is a very white thing. And it is a stand in for that great sense of loss that we feel in our relationships, in our spiritual lives, in our understanding of community. The me is removal. It's a removal of the person from community. But I don't think the champ ever read himself this way. Quite the opposite. Yes, he was the greatest. But he was never separate. He was never isolated. He was always part of something larger. And I would even hazard to guess, this is incredibly arrogant of me, but I would hazard to guess that he knew he was the greatest, not based on himself, but because he knew he was not separate. When he was rejected by white America for taking a stance against Vietnam, he was never rejected by black people, even those who disagreed with his position. In 1967, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King went public with his anti-war stance, and when he did, he quoted the champ. Like Muhammad Ali puts it, "We are all, black, brown, and poor, victims of the same system of oppression." Muhammad Ali brought Dr. King along. How does it feel not just to be an athlete, but to be an icon because you have transcended your sport to become an inspiration and a voice for the people who supported you? Whee! This isn't the isolated me. This is the deeply embedded me, a me that was able to become because other people helped you, cared for you, supported you, sacrificed for you, and now you have the chance to give back. Whee! Okay, now hopefully you remember what each one of your pipe cleaners represented for you. Or maybe you have a little note to remind yourself. Because we're going to go another level down, or another level up, or in. Well, who knows? It's fine if you don't agree with me, but it is my belief that someone helped you realize each of these values. Someone helped you realize each of these values. None of us are islands. None of us came up with these values on our own. Each of us is a product of our community. So take just a moment. Ria's going to play something contemplative this time. Just a moment to reflect on each of these pipe cleaners and see if you can remember one story for each of them. Right? Someone taught you this value. Someone passed along this wisdom. Someone helped you become who you are. And when you have a story for each pipe cleaner, where these values come from, turn back to your neighbor. Some of you can be quite chatty. So I want to wrap up in an hour and a quarter. So let's be economical with our stories, but, take the time you need. But make sure there's enough time for both of you to share. But let's not hop right in. Take a moment to think about the stories that brought you to the value that you created your sculpture out of. Who helped this me become a whee? All right, Ria, take them away. When you're ready, turn to your neighbor. Right? Because as I was writing this sermon, it dawned on me that there was a third interpretation. There is a third. As I already said, the majority of the articles and blogs only interpreted the poem as me, we. W-E. And that few considered the possibility of we. But when it was done, it was always interpreted as a binary, right? Either it was we or it was we. And today, I now am open to the idea that the champ could have been operating on two levels, toying with the complexity of the sound of we, in a way that really gives us access to the sense of joy that comes when we belong to something greater than ourselves. Why is this interpretation not offered anywhere? Probably racism. right? If Robert Frost or Emily Dickinson had delivered this poem, there would have been deep analysis on the double meaning of the sound. I guarantee you. But Muhammad Ali was a boxer who, according to his own account, graduated high school with a D- average, claiming they only gave him the minus because he won the Olympics. And Muhammad Ali was dyslexic, struggled to read, right? No doubt, never receiving the help that he needed to succeed in that racist school system of Kentucky in the 40s and 50s. And I doubt that Ali would ever claim to write like Frost or Dickinson, but it doesn't really matter. Doesn't mean he wasn't capable of complex wordplay. In fact, we know that he was, which is why it is entirely possible that he was playing with the sound of we to deliver an even deeper message. It's not that the blogs were entirely wrong. They were wrong about the poem. He didn't say W-E. But they were right about the fact that we live in an age of me, that we live in an age of selfishness. We live in an age, increasingly so, of isolation. And I do want to be cautious because many white liberals speak of the black community as some panacea of all things that are good, and the white community of all things that are bad, like it's some magical space of liberation. And the black community has plenty of problems too. It's not always supportive. It's not always liberative. And we shouldn't idolize other communities, making them a fantasy of who they are, even if there are a great many things that white people can learn from black people and black community about liberation. And the we felt by the champ was possible. It was possible because it was a collective we, felt by the we, enjoyed by the community. His success was their success. Maybe even to the point where there might not have even been a his or theirs. When he said, I am the greatest, how possible is it that the I he was referencing was a collective I? I think it's very possible. The joy he felt was the joy of many because the sacrifices he made were done on the behalf of the many. Becoming the greatest does not mean you overcame obstacles or you had the most skill. Now, I don't know this for sure. I don't follow boxing that closely, but there are probably boxers who come from humbler origins and who won more titles. I honestly don't know. But that isn't what made Muhammad Ali the greatest. What made him the greatest, what made him the champ, was his willingness to give it all up for the possibility of improvement, for the possible benefit of his community. There was no guarantee when he said no to going to Vietnam at the age of 25. Do you know how stupid I was at 25? When he was 25, he gave it up. There was no guarantee that there would be a return to glory. He gave up money, he gave up fame, he gave up being loved, all for the chance that he could make the world better. But he didn't get to that place on his own. Someone showed him the meaning of love, and that love requires sacrifice with no guarantee of success. But he loved so much, he was able to make that sacrifice. This is what made him the champ. This is why we're still talking about him, and I don't know, maybe I know 3 other boxers, right? And they will fade, and he will not. So in our final exercise this morning, I want you to form little groups. I know, here you go, get together. And we are going to need to be cognizant about how much of each of us are talking, blah, blah. You understand that part. But I want you to talk about one part of this community where you see the impact of me. right? Because it's part of our culture. There is a culture of isolation and loneliness and selfishness, and it exists everywhere, including this church. And we can get caught up in it. I want my thing, and I don't want that thing, right? Where does that exist here? Special points to those who are willing to admit to a moment when you have acted selfishly here. It's very easy to say, oh, that's Sue Lamb. She is a selfish so-and-so. Always pushing her agenda, right? They want this church to be their way, right? Super easy to do that. Let's leave people's names out of it, right? But it is harder to admit than when we do it, but probably all of us have, right? So if in your group, if there are people who are willing, let them go first because they get extra points. And if there isn't anybody, that's okay. Let's just talk about where that selfishness does appear here. But I don't want you to stay there because I want you to add what you are going to bring. You are going to disconnect one of the values from your little creation because sacrifice is required. And you are going to shape it, and you are going to pass it to somebody else in your little group, and they are going to attach theirs. And you are going to talk about why this value is important and how you believe it is going to help us become a we. And not just a we, but a we as a we. Right? And don't sting anybody right now. So please turn to your neighbors. Let the person who's willing to be courageous go first, and then share as you might. Share one thing that brings up selfishness and one thing that brings community.